my friends, even though we are ahead of time, we have a lot to discuss today, so I am going to reward early arrivers by getting right down to it. I am Corey Shockey, the Deputy Director General of this outstanding institution, and I have the great pleasure today to grill one of our finest, Nigel Inkster, who's the Senior Advisor on a whole range of subjects here, which all come under the future and present of war category. As many of you know, he was a 31-year veteran of the British Secret Intelligence Service, retiring as Assistant Chief and Director of Operations. He's an expert on transnational terrorism, on intelligence, on cyber, on the evolution of warfare, and he is going to today regale us on the Advancing Cyber Stability report that he was a major part of. My friend.
Thank you very much, Corey. Thank you very much for chairing this. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. The genesis of this was the creation of a thing called the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, which kicked off in March 2017 at the Munich Security Conference. The genesis for this exercise, which was initially funded primarily by the Dutch Foreign Ministry and acquired support from some other foreign ministries, plus private sector organizations like Microsoft, was a general perception by people in the cyber security community writ large that a period of relative strategic stability that we had come to be familiar with was starting to fray at the edges, shall we say, and that there was clearly a redistribution of global power taking place, and in that context we were concerned that the cyber domain potentially, though recognizing the very significant benefits that it had brought to humanity, also had the potential to act as a very significant vector for instability and to make things a lot worse if we were not careful, for all sorts of reasons that I'll go into. So this was the genesis of the commission that was formed. All right, me and PowerPoint, what could possibly go wrong? The membership was, as you can see from this map, the red bits, other parts of the globe from whom we had commissioners. We didn't actually have one separately for Alaska, but a good mix of people from different parts of the world, and also a good mix of people with experience in government, in politics, in academia, the technology companies, and the what's called the third sector, civil liberties and human rights. All pooling their collective experience in this enterprise, and also I think a very good age range from wrinkly old pensioners like myself down to relatively young upcoming scholars and private sector personnel. So it was a very good mix. I'm not going to worry about that too much, but I'll talk to a couple of slides that that come later. But essentially, what we set out to do was firstly to decide what we meant by stability in cyberspace. And of course, stability as a technical definition, there are many different technical definitions. In physics, stability is essentially the ability of a body to restore to its original static equilibrium after it has been displaced. In strategic studies in our field, it's more about deterrence, the concept of mutually assured destruction, and instability being represented by a surprise move or development by one or other nuclear armed adversaries. And this kind of definition of stability we felt didn't really cover what we were thinking about. So we did, in fact, come up with our own definition of stability in cyberspace, which goes, stability in cyberspace means everyone can be reasonably confident of their ability to use cyberspace safely and securely, where the ability and utility and integrity of services and information provided in and through cyberspace are generally assured, where change is managed in relative peace, and where tensions are resolved in a non-escalatory manner. Now, people are free to quibble with that definition and offer views on its suitability, but we felt that what we needed to do was to make the point that one of the key things we were concerned about was to ensure that nobody did anything in cyberspace that would actually degrade or deprive us of the basic utility of the internet. Given that so much is now depends upon it, and there can be no doubt, I think, that the internet has enabled very significant changes in logistics chains, just-in-time delivery, etc., and disruptions here can have some very significant adverse consequences. Although it's not really cyber-related, I remember in the year 2000, if I'm not mistaken, we had here in the UK a strike by petrol tanker drivers. And we discovered that there was a small group of critical nodes which, if blockaded, would mean that petrol would run out very quickly, and at that point we calculated that within 3 days the supermarkets would be empty of food. And this was kind of a foretaste of the situation we now face within the cyber domain, the criticality of dependence on internet-enabled supply chains and services. So I mentioned the positive impacts of the internet, the cyber domain. They really have, quite fundamentally changed our concepts of knowledge and information, and have changed in quite fundamental ways how we conduct most aspects of our life. But there is a very significant downside that is becoming increasingly apparent in the cyber domain. Cyber criminality, the estimated global cost of which is something close to 1% of global GDP. Now, that may not sound a hell of a lot, but in a world where global growth is slowing down as population continues to increase, losing that amount of revenue collectively does matter. And of course, how many of you recall reading in the press or hearing in some other media about the arrest and prosecution of criminals involved in cybercrime? No, I didn't think so, because it happens so seldom. Precisely because cybercrime is so easy to do, the risk of getting caught is virtually non-existent, because much cybercrime is cross-border. The criminals are located in jurisdictions where they can't be found. Police forces and other investigative agencies lack the skills and resources effectively to investigate this sort of crime. So, and added to the phenomenon of cybercrime, and it really is something that any idiot can do. You don't need to be a computer expert to be involved in cybercrime. You have the added problem of state complicity, a classic example being that of the DPRK, North Korea, which trains and instructs its cyber hackers to engage in various forms of cyber criminality to swell the state's coffers. An example of that being the WannaCry attack in 2017, which was experienced here in the UK and lots of other countries around the world. And the scale of this kind of criminality, often with an interface with the state, is becoming ever greater. The NotPetya attack that took place a couple of years ago started as an attack on the Ukraine, but spread around the world to the point where it disabled some major international corporations, a particular example being Maersk, a shipping conglomerate responsible for, I think, about 30% of total global shipping. Their entire networks were taken out for a period of several weeks. The port of Newark was taken out of action for a period of time. The total cost of cleaning up this particular attack, which was what I would call a pseudo ransomware attack. It presented as ransomware, but the purpose was not to collect ransom, was somewhere in the order of 10 billion US dollars. And the point is, this kind of crime is, this level of cyber criminality is happening more and more. Then we come to the whole state-on-state piece in relation to the cyber domain, and the growing phenomenon of operations taking place, offensive operations by states conducted at a level below that of armed conflict. And this includes large-scale influence operations, obvious example being alleged Russian interference in the US presidential elections in 2016. Well, there's nothing really alleged about it because it's pretty clear what happened. And an attack of this kind has all kinds of implications. Not only does it potentially skew the outcome of an electoral contest, but what more importantly it does is call into question the trustworthiness of the entire electoral process, which is much more damaging. Just look at the furore that's been going on in the United States for a couple of years after the election about who did what, who knew what, when, what the consequences were, and this has been very corrosive of public trust. What we're looking at here is a phenomenon that I've come to think of as an asymmetry of vulnerability, in which weaker states are actually at an advantage in relation to more powerful states, precisely because more powerful states, in particular the United States, being so heavily network dependent, are much more vulnerable to disruption. A country like North Korea is virtually invulnerable to disruption because virtually nothing it's got is network dependent. And we see another example of where this has happened is the case of Iran, which a few years ago, in response to pressure over its incipient nuclear weapons program, launched a series of attacks on the US financial system, all relatively small scale, all carefully calibrated to serve as a signaling exercise. Don't push us too far, because this is the kind of thing that we can do. And the problem with this kind of behavior is that it does have the potential for escalation. The Iranian case, I think, is a very interesting one in that regard. You do things in the cyber domain, the attacks that I just referred to, nothing much happens. The next thing, you've got the Iranians launching missile attacks on Saudi Arabia's premier oil refinery in Abqaiq. And the message that goes with that is, we did this, you couldn't do anything about it, which is the same thing with the US presidential election. Russia was essentially saying, yeah, we did this, you know perfectly well we did it, what are you going to do about it? Nothing. In that sense, what we're looking at here is enormous potential for escalation, precisely because the cyber domain offers this sense of impunity. It also, we have no rules of the road in relation to this, and I'll come to that in a moment in more detail. We have the risks of signals and activities that are misread, and I would submit that the very pervasive industrial cyber espionage being conducted by China against the United States falls into that category, because it's clearly been a very significant proximate cause in the US decision to enter into what is being called a trade war with China. This is one of the major grievances that the United States has with China, and which is seeking to redress in the ongoing negotiations. So these things can be misread. And then we have the problem of what I would call the defense attack equation, because essentially within the cyber domain, the advantage tends to lie with the attacker, at least in the short term. It's relatively easy to attack networks which, because of the fundamental architecture of the internet, are endemically vulnerable. We also, so the incentive for states that have significant cyber capabilities is to adopt a more offensive posture, because you really can't defend in the cyber domain without being actively engaged, looking for threats, looking for where they're coming from, looking for what they look like, and thinking about what you might need to do to protect against these threats. You cannot, in the cyber domain, construct a kind of Maginot Line, sit behind it and hope that on the day you're going to be able to defend against an incoming attack, particularly if you don't actually understand the nature of that attack or the reasons why it is being launched. And what we've seen in the state-on-state relationship is the emergence of the concept promoted by the US Cyber Command of persistent engagement. Identify who your adversaries are and get on their case all the time. Now, this I think has a certain logic to it, but it also does contain some risks because in the US conception, persistent engagement is really an exercise in retortion, trying to dissuade adversaries from engaging in malign behavior and encouraging them to return to normal, acceptable standards of behavior. But if the adversaries don't see it like that, don't read it that way, and see it as aggressive and offensive behavior, the escalatory potential, I think, is pretty self-evident. So these are some of the issues that we were looking at. And of course, one of the things that's just about to happen is already happening, but with the advent of 5G communications will, I suspect, increase very rapidly, is the whole Internet of Things, which creates potentially a much greater attack surface and potentially the nightmare of huge numbers of insecure and unsecurable devices fitted into domestic devices, fridges, what have you, being linked to the internet. So you can see that, firstly, the attack surface is much greater, but also the potential for ordinary and otherwise law-abiding citizens to be drawn inadvertently into criminal engagement through having their domestic devices made part of criminal botnets. Is something that we all have to be concerned about. I don't think people really should be criminalised because somebody's taken over their fridge and is using it to engage in a cyber heist or a massive denial of service attacks. But the potential actually is there. And then, as I said, the concern that ever more emboldened actors in the cyber domain, emboldened precisely because there appears to be little in the way of risk of retribution for their behaviours, might actually rise to the level where it could potentially jeopardize the core of the internet. In other words, reduce or deprive us entirely of this functionality. Now, in some ways, I think that would be quite difficult to do, because up until now, the internet, which, let us not forget, is a network of networks, has shown itself to be very robust, very resilient, and has so far been able to bounce back from some quite disruptive activities that have taken place on it. But there are some key nodes of vulnerability. The routers, obviously the cables that provide the actual connectivity, the routers, other devices that make up the functionality of the internet, the domain name system, the global address book of the internet. And we are starting now to see attacks on elements of the domain name system, which, if they were to get out of hand, could be potentially very destabilizing. If all of a sudden the servers that make up the domain name system stop talking to each other, we're in trouble. And it's not unimaginable that we could find ourselves in that situation. And all this, is very much shaped by the reality that we don't have any agreed rules of the road for controlling this still relatively new and still rapidly developing space domain. If we look at internet governance, for example, up until now, this has been a very informal set of arrangements, which we've come to call the multi-stakeholder arrangement, essentially whereby interested stakeholders, interested parties, get together in fora like the Internet Engineering Task Force to agree, the protocols and engineering standards that govern the Internet. And the IETF is open to anyone to take part who has the relevant technical qualifications. But there are quite a few states who view the multi-stakeholder model with distrust and want to see it replaced by a model in which national governments, so to speak, have the whip hand in determining how global cyber governance should be conducted, and no prizes for guessing which these states are. They tend to be at the more authoritarian end of the spectrum: Russia, China, and states in the so-called G77 who share these authoritarian instincts. We've been through a series of global meetings starting in 2003 with the World Summit on the Internet Society, convened by the UN, to look at all of this and see what we could make of it. And basically the conclusion has been that what we're looking at here is a complex ecosystem, which one of my fellow commissioners, Dr. Wolfgang Kleinwächter, has, I think, very appropriately likened to a rainforest. Is something that no one entity can be in charge of, can be on top of. We need to find ways to integrate the different bits of the ecosystem and the people who seek to govern it, and we haven't yet found that model. And when it comes to global cyber security, since 2004, we have seen the primary global focus for this, the rather ponderously named United Nations Group of Governmental Experts in the Field of Information and Communications in the context of international security.
Please tell me at least adds up to a good acronym.
UNGGE, but the thing is there are lots of UNGGEs. It's a pretty standard UN formulation for getting stuff done.
It should have to spell out cyber, spell out stability.
Well, it is. It's a cyber UNGGE. That's been meeting since 2004, and in all that time, there are 25 nations taking part on a kind of rolling basis, with the major security states always represented. And what they've come up with basically is two areas of more or less agreement. One is that existing international law should apply in the cyber domain, as should existing conventions in relation to state sovereignty. So in other words, giving something to the United States and its allies on the one hand, and Russia, China and the G77 on the other. But that hasn't taken us very far, because there is still intense, unresolved debate on issues of what would constitute a legitimate state response to an internationally wrongful act conducted in the cyber domain, and whether the law of armed conflict applies in the cyber domain. I think the more authoritarian states are arguing that the law of armed conflict shouldn't be introduced into this equation, because to do so would, in essence, legitimize conflict within the cyber domain. The United States takes a rather different view. Point is, we haven't really got any agreement on any of this. China and Russia have argued for an international treaty on cyberspace, this too has been resisted as effectively unworkable, and at the moment we're really still feeling our way. So there's very little in the way of international law that people are agreed on. International lawyers have tried to put some more definition on this through the production of 2 iterations of what is called the Tallinn Manual, which goes into great detail on how international law should, might, does apply in the cyber domain. But this is simply the opinion of a bunch of international lawyers, and it has no formal status in international law. Even though quite a lot of people do use it, do cite it, and do have justly a lot of respect for the people who came up with what is again a consensus document. So, in the absence of anything in the way of internationally agreed rules of the road, things that we must do, the next best thing is norms of conduct. And well, I mean, norms have been a thing in international relations for an awful long time. They're not laws. They can become laws, and they can follow from laws. But what they are essentially are agreed modes of behaviour between particular interest groups. And these norms, if sufficient, if they gather sufficient currency and are widely enough adopted, sorry, I should have done that before, can be a reliable guide to behaviour. And actually the UNGGE, that much maligned organisation with the impossible title, did in its 2015 meeting come up with a list of 11 norms of responsible state behaviour in the cyber domain, which were the subject of a consensus agreement. Now, of course, the problem with norms is that one can come up with norms. The question is, how do you actually get people to observe and adopt them? And when we were looking at all of this, we concluded as a commission that there were some norms of conduct particularly relevant to the stability issue within the cyber domain, and these were the ones that we came up with. There are 8 up there. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail because they're available in the report, the Commission report, if you're interested, to dig deeper. But what I wanted to do was to make the point that perhaps the most important norm that we came up with, and we came up with it very quickly, was the norm to protect the public core of the Internet. And this is something that is already getting quite a lot of take-up in other international fora. It's a norm that has 2 parts. One is states and non-state actors should not take actions to jeopardize the public core of the Internet, which we do define not exhaustively, but broadly covering the areas I mentioned earlier, but also should exercise responsibility to take action if they see the public core of the Internet being jeopardized. So it is about having a sense of responsibility to take action in this regard. And responsibility is something that we argued is not exclusive to states. It is very much a function of non-state actors down to and including individuals to take such actions. We emphasise too the importance of cyber hygiene, and what do I mean by that? Well, I said earlier that architecture of the internet is such that it does, unfortunately, render it endemically insecure. There are always going to be vulnerabilities in the internet architecture we've got, unless it is significantly changed. But those vulnerabilities, I would argue, are increased substantially by virtue of the basic business model of the internet. We're talking about an industry worth, at a conservative estimate, $4 trillion a year, that operates on the principle of rush to market. Get your product out there and commercialize before the other guy does, and don't worry about security. The 400 billion per annum cybersecurity industry will take care of that, only, spoiler alert, it can't. And so particularly in the context that I just mentioned, where we have the potential for a significant expansion of the Internet of Things, huge numbers of additional devices enabled by the hyperconnectivity that 5G purports to provide, we really need to start thinking more about how to incentivize, encourage, and maybe compel security by design. This in itself would be a significant plus for all of us. I said we see responsibility as not something that is unique to governments, but we do mention, we do highlight certain areas where we think that should be the unique preserve of governments. And in that context, we argued, for example, that behavior by private actors in response to cyber attacks, so-called hack back, should be outlawed. And I'll give you an example of how hackback can blow back rather dramatically. I mentioned the Iranian attacks on the US financial system that took place a few years ago. When these attacks happened, some of the banks and financial institutions on the receiving end of these attacks, not understanding what these attacks were for, not appreciating them, that they were actually a rather subtly calibrated signaling device, went after the perpetrators and attacked their networks. The net result was exactly what we would expect, an escalating cycle, and the US federal authorities had to intervene quite forcibly to put a lid on this before it got out of hand. So hackback really is a bad idea, and what we are in fact arguing for is the cyber equivalent of the concept of a monopoly on the use of force by the state within the cyber domain, which we think is important as a stabilizing exercise. We argue in another norm that actors should not knowingly build vulnerabilities into commercial applications that are widely used by the public. We also argue that criminal botnets should be outlawed more effectively. Now, botnets, let's be clear, there are good botnets and there are bad botnets. A botnet is basically just a network of computers that are engaged in boring, repetitive tasks with a speed and intensity and consistency that human beings can't match. And these nets are critical to the functionality of the internet. What we're talking about here is the involuntary creation of botnets for malign purposes, taking over large numbers of computers in a network for purposes like denial of service attacks and in the process, as I mentioned earlier, potentially inadvertently criminalizing ordinary civilian users whose devices have, unknown to them, been co-opted into a digital criminal enterprise. The other point worth highlighting, I think, in all of this is the norm that we have on vulnerability equities. Now, to the uninitiated, vulnerability equities is a pretty meaningless term, but what we're talking about here is a situation in which governments become aware of vulnerabilities in commercial internet applications, and rather than alerting the manufacturers to the existence of these vulnerabilities, keep them to themselves for use in what we believe are broadly legitimate national security purposes. A case in point, you have an encrypted communications app which you know is being used by a terrorist organization or a criminal conspiracy, a paedophile circle or something like that. By exploiting a vulnerability that you have uncovered, you can listen in on the communications of these entities, and a government might legitimately opt to do so, even though the continued existence of this vulnerability potentially jeopardizes the interests of legitimate users of the app. What we're saying with this norm is, governments will do this. Governments have legitimate reasons to want to do it. But what we argue should happen is that governments should have some established and transparent mechanism for indicating the criteria that they would apply in deciding whether to keep knowledge of these vulnerabilities to themselves or make them known to the originators. And actually this particular norm has already been adopted by a number of states, the USA, the UK, I believe Australia too, if I'm not mistaken, and other states are thinking seriously about doing it. So we're kind of getting some traction here. I should wrap up because I want to leave some time for questions. We produced a report and we launched it at the Paris Peace Forum earlier this month. But we were clear from the outset that our purpose was not to just produce another piece of paper that would gather dust on shelves, as so many other comparable reports have done. What we are critically about is, as I mentioned, working out how these norms of behaviour and the wider appreciation of what needs to be done in relation to cyberspace stability can be taken forward by other interested groups, by other organisations. So actually, for us as a commission, although we still exist, though we're not having regular meetings, the work has really just begun. And we are now on the lookout for ways to promote the ideas that we've got in the report through other organisations, through interested parties. So it's a kind of ongoing work of proselytisation. And we don't think that things like these norms are the digital equivalent of mosaic tablets. What we want is for interested groups to take these, work with them, develop them, maybe turn them into something rather different from what they started out being, but actually adopt them and try to implement them. So that's really where we are now.
I think that's a perfect place to hand over to the sharpshooters I see around the table. The greatest thing about the IISS is that lifeblood of talented, intelligent people who come to fire on the ramparts of talks given here. So I have a whole bunch of questions I would like to ask, but I will give everybody else early salvos instead of myself. Who wants the chance to ask a question first? Okay, too slow on the uptake.
Yeah.
I'll get to you in a second. Here's my first
All right.
note.
Okay, Corey, I knew you were going to give me a hard time.
It seems to me there's a contradiction between two of your norms. One, that governments should have the monopoly of retaliation for attacks. So ruling out hackbacks, and people should rely on the state to be the omniscient and judicious actor in this regard. That seems to me, especially to the tech community, to seem at a contradiction with the belief that that it's okay for states to be using vulnerabilities they identify for state purposes. How do you square those two things? More importantly, how are you going to get people to adopt these norms given those contradictions?
Well, it's not going to be easy, and I accept that there is potentially a contradiction here. This is what I said about these norms being very much a work in progress, the kind of first step on the journey. And we may well find that there is that they need to be revised or rethought. Or even junked in favour of something else, if it proves that they are not practical. I do, however, think that vulnerability equities are in themselves a very difficult contentious issue. There's a lot of sentiment. I would expect from particularly the civil liberties and human rights communities a lot of pushback on this particular norm. There would be an argument saying basically, what you are doing is in effect legitimizing, aggressive or offensive behavior within the cyber domain, and this is not something that you should be doing. There will be a purist, absolutist view that says we should simply outlaw such behavior to core. That is a debate that is going to have to be played out, and we want it to be played out in as many fora as possible. But I mean, in terms of the state monopoly on sort of use of force, I think I think that is essentially a defensible concept. The last thing we want is all kind of independent franc-tireurs acting on their own account on the internet with only a partial and incomplete understanding of the context in which they are operating.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Please introduce yourself.
Former law enforcement intelligence analyst covering transnational organised crime. My question relates to your closing comments about the work of the Commission continuing, but also being taken on by other organisations and interested parties. Where are the positive, the good news signs of early action on that, and where perhaps are there some worrying cases that perhaps people who should be taking it up but aren't?
Well, I mean, we are getting some take-up. This report, has been cited in a number of international fora. It was launched at the Paris Peace Forum, which was an initiative by the French government, begun at the end of last year, and some of those, some of the norms that we advocated for, particularly the one about protecting the public core of the internet, have been adopted. So they are starting to form part of the wider debate. One of our first chair, Marina Kaljurand, former foreign minister of Estonia, was one of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on internet-related issues. So we have that interface with the United Nations. We're seeking to engage with the UNGGE, which has kicked off again. There are two processes now. There's the UNGGE and a separate process, an open-ended working group, or both addressing issues of cyber security. And we're seeking to engage with both of them. And a number of our commissioners are active and involved in more technical areas. The Internet Governance Forum, the Internet Engineering Task Force, ICANN. We have commissioners who routinely attend these events. I think we are operating on a broad front. More traction in some places than others, but what we're not getting is repudiation. What we're not getting is people who are saying this is a waste of time and we don't agree with any of it. We are getting people who say we're not sure we agree with this, that, or the other. Well, that's fine. We always anticipated that. I think where I worry most is notwithstanding the fact that we did have 2 commissioners from China and 1 from Russia, that these countries are, on the face of it, showing less interest in the promotion of some of these recommendations than others, and I think that's something that we need to worry about. I'm not saying they're rejecting it; they haven't done that, but I personally would like to see more in the way of active engagement by these states.
Next up.
I'm Alex Folks. I work with OSCE and the EU on election observation issues. My question doesn't necessarily relate to that. The 2 points I'd like to make. The first is, if I run a company, whether it's a bank or a smaller company, and we are subject to an attack, and the only retaliation that can happen needs to be via a state actor. My concern is that state actors aren't renowned for sharing their intelligence with private individuals or organisations. So we tend to get a patronising tap on the head saying, there, we'll take care of it. But you've got to understand it's got to fit into the wider geopolitical national interest side of things. We never see any more. So I wonder if you could comment on that. The second thing is, most of these attacks, to my understanding, are, in rare cases they are direct state actions, but in most cases they are one step removed. Whether they are genuinely independent or whether they are commissioned by states but somewhat denial. So my question there is, how do we possibly implement these norms when a country that has a wish to attack an election, I feel, or whatever, can say, hold their hands up and say, it wasn't us, Gov. It may have been somebody else. And of course we'll look into it, and of course we'll investigate and punish accordingly. But nothing ever happened. So I'm wondering how far forward these norms take us in that respect.
Okay, well, to answer, take those 2 in order. I mean, if you look at what's the National Cybersecurity Centre in this country is trying to do in that regard, it is precisely about addressing your point, the need to be more proactive and to share a lot more information about attackers and attacks than would traditionally be the case. And I think that that is a model and approach that we would seek to encourage more generally. I'm not saying everybody's got to have an NCSC equivalent, but give serious thought to how you do more effectively enable private actors to defend themselves. That clearly has got to happen, and information sharing has got to be a part of that. I think the NCSC have come a long way, in fact, in terms of being much more outward-facing and proactive in sharing information. But obviously, there's a lot more to do. They've come from a culture of sort of total secrecy and omerta, and it takes a while to move into a more public-facing engagement. On the issue of cyber proxies, I mean, you have a perfectly fair point, but at the end of the day, under international law, states can be held responsible for the actions of proxy actors that can't fall under their remit, and there are various levers and pressure points that can be brought to bear, and at the end of the day, under international law, if in country X is using a cyber proxy to do damage to country Y, and having been informed of this opts to do nothing about it, country Y is actually entitled under international law to take action to deal with that threat. So there are I mean, international law does not give cyber proxies a free pass. We've just not been very good at actually working out how to implement it effectively, and whether you do it in domain or cross domain. All these considerations come in, and you also have to think about what an escalatory ladder looks like, and whether you have escalatory dominance before you start down this road. But it's not as if we're completely devoid of possibilities here.
I'm laughing because at the IISS Manama Dialogue in Bahrain this last weekend, General Mackenzie, the CENTCOM commander, was challenged about American and coalition military actions precipitating escalation on the part of Iran. And he had a really beautiful answer to it, which is, they may have the next step on the ladder, but I've got the top step on the ladder. And I think the challenge in a cyber environment is both attribution and also the fact that states don't want to, even if states are going to be where we rely for retaliation, they don't want to make clear what their abilities on the top steps of the ladder are until they need them, and especially because, unlike other kinds of weapons, cyber weapons are reusable.
I mean, on the attribution point, of course, you can do attribution, but it requires a lot of resources.
You can do forensic attribution.
But basically, it's also a function of intelligence.
Sorry.
First and then second. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to come back on that just to say that one of the issues is, particularly in elections, and we've seen it very clearly within America, and also I would argue with the UK referendum and other cases, that actually to admit that there has been an attack invites questions as to the legitimacy of yourself as an ex-politician, which means that Trump doesn't acknowledge it, and the UK government doesn't go anywhere near that. So I would add that into the complication.
Excellent point. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Alex Rigger, I'm a PhD researcher in cybersecurity at University of Cambridge, and I just had two sort of one observation and one question. One is, it seems amongst these norms that some of the bad actors are becoming states themselves if they're adopting an increasingly offensive posture. The persistent engagement idea that the US is adopting surely is what is making cyberspace, the cyber domain, more and more insecure themselves, and is there some sort of, that could escalate in all sorts of ways just as a default state setting, and is there any way that a norm debate could step back from that, led by places like the US? The second point or question I had was, could there also be some sort of costs to platforms and technology companies and stuff like that for some of these vulnerabilities?
It's a great
both in the way that we're seeing Boeing prosecuted at the moment for their bad tech, costing lives, but also a lot of this disinformation things need large-scale audiences that are provided by some of these companies, and could be something that.
Yeah. I'm amazed insurance companies haven't moved forward on this.
Yeah, well, I mean, the insurance sector is actually starting to look at this more, but it isn't straightforward. And at the moment, the tech companies pretty much have a free pass on this. You're absolutely right, and yes, it should. I mean, I think this is really part of what I was talking about, security by design. If you knowingly market an insecure product, and Adobe Acrobat is a great case in point. A known vector for software that has been marketed for years and years with no penalty, no comeback. Everybody knows that this is a sort of vector, for the bad guys, to get inside your network, and they have suffered no penalty for this. That should change. There does need to be change here. On the first point, I think persistent engagement, yes, is problematic. It is problematic. I understand why the United States is doing it, because for a long time I think they felt like a sort of the world's cyber punch bag. Everybody's having a go at them because, as I said, they're so heavily networked, and it's easy to do. And again, there has been no real penalty to be paid for doing this. So I think that the point, people have decided the point has come where something has to be done, and persistent engagement is the answer. And persistent engagement with certain adversaries, I think, does make a certain amount of sense. But it is not without its risks, and I've no doubt that General Nakasone and his guys are well aware of these and are thinking about them. But I don't think there's an easy or straightforward solution here.
Speaking of the top of the escalation ladder, I will give the last question to Marcus Willett.
Oh God, this is where I get taken apart.
Just a couple of comments and then a question. On attribution, I think actually it's a dangerous thing. Attribution isn't easy and doable.
No.
Because it is. The problem around attribution is making that attribution and the way you've done it public.
Yeah.
But when it really matters, states do. So when the Russians do something in Salisbury, then you really do let the world know that you really do know who these people are, and embarrass the hell out of them. So that's kind of attribution. On hackback, firstly, it is illegal. It breaks the Computer Misuse Act in the UK to hack back unless you're properly authorised by a Secretary of State. But that's a technicality. The more important thing is, well, it's not more important if you're the person trying to hack back. You are a criminal if you hack back and you're not properly authorised. It's just worth remembering that. But the reason I think it's good to be made a decision by states is that it's a dangerous thing to think that if you're attacked in cyberspace, you need to respond in cyberspace.
Exactly.
Actually, there's a much more sophisticated decision that needs to be made, and there have been lots of stories in the States, even states thinking hacking back was a good idea when it plainly wasn't. They were much better off resorting to sanctions or day marches or something else. My question is, those norms and everything you've been describing, I can see how all those red countries that you put up at the beginning could be bought into something if we have one model of how the internet works, much as we've got today. But it's already starting to splinter. If we had two models, if we had a Chinese-dominated, more authoritarian-looking, cyber sovereignty version of the internet, and a lot of those G77 countries that you mentioned are all deciding, that's the way we want to go, and then we have a much smaller version of the internet that we've got now. Does all of that go out of the window, and it's a free-for-all?
Yeah, well, very good point. I mean, just on attribution, I would say that I was at a meeting in China a couple of years ago when the question of attribution was being discussed, and one of my Chinese interlocutors, this was after the 2015 exposure of Unit 61938 in Shanghai, said rather ruefully, some states are better at attribution than others. That is a classic example of where attribution can be done, but as you rightly observe, it's a complex process. It's not just a digital forensic exercise, it also involves intelligence equities and other things, and it's a complicated equation to balance. On the question of what would the implications of a splinter net be, I think very much we feel, what we hope is that these norms would encourage people to think twice about going down that particular route, because as you say, if it does happen, we will almost certainly end up with a free-for-all. And I think it may not be the internet per se that does this, but I think the kind of face-off that we're now seeing between the US and China on technology writ large, the so-called decoupling, which is not the USA's intention. What the US is about is retortion, but again, that signal is not necessarily being correctly read. And if we do find sort of technology decoupling writ large, that is going to have very significant detrimental implications for everybody. And yes, it would create the incentive for more egregious online misbehaviour. It's something we really don't want to encourage. Whether we can stop it is another matter.
On that cheerful, uplifting holiday note, my friends, thank you for coming to think about this important issue with us, and won't you join me in thanking Nigel Inkster?